The metallic sound of the heavy steel door reverberated through the walls of the space prison, each knock echoing as an ominous reminder of its reality. Kale felt his heart racing in his chest, almost as if he wanted to get away from it all. His thoughts were a chaotic storm, mixing fear, despair, and a fragile hope of survival. The entrance to the arena was in front of him, lit only by the cold, artificial lights flickering from the high ceiling. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his mind, but the air there seemed charged, dense, making every breath difficult. "I need to get out alive," he repeated like a silent mantra. His taut body felt the weight of the armor, each piece looking more like a chain than a protection. As he advanced, footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor, he could hear the cheering on the other side, eager and wild. The shouts and applause were like the roar of a hungry beast, longing for spectacle, blood, and victory. Every step was a struggle against the desire to run away, to hide, to give up. But giving up was not an option. As he walked through the last door, the arena opened up before him like a vast futuristic coliseum. The intense lights almost blinded him for a moment, and he needed precious seconds to adjust his vision. The clamor of the crowd hit him like a wave, a tidal wave of contradictory emotions. Some fans shouted his name, "Kale, Kale," while others mocked and hurled insults, fueling chaos with their provocations. He couldn't see them clearly, but he felt their stares, their ravenous expectations driven into his skin like invisible daggers. Kale realized that he was not only fighting for his life, but also for a piece of humanity that still clung, fragile, within him. The feeling of being a caged animal, a spectacle for the amusement of others, aroused a mixture of anger and sadness that he needed to control. At that moment, Kale raised his head, trying to find strength in fragility. He wasn't just a prisoner, he was a survivor. Every scar on her body was a testament to her past struggles, to her resilience. "They won't break me," he thought, clenching his fists. The arena was an unforgiving battlefield, but it was also a stage. And Kale, despite his fear, knew that every step inside was a step toward his freedom, even if that freedom was just a distant mirage. With one last deep breath, he entered the arena, ready to face his fate. The arena built on Mars was a monumental structure, a symbol of a dystopian era in which justice had turned into entertainment. Built like a Moderna Colosseum, its high, rounded walls were made of a shiny, sturdy metal, reflecting the artificial lights that lit up the Martian landscape. The construction was a masterpiece of space engineering, designed to withstand the harsh conditions of the Red Planet and at the same time provide an unsurpassed spectacle. In the center of the arena, a multifaceted battlefield stretched, with dynamic obstacles that could be controlled remotely to add surprise elements during combat. The soil was a mixture of Martian sand and advanced technology, capable of reconfiguring itself according to the needs of the organizers. The inner walls of the arena were lined with holographic screens, displaying in real time the fights and the reactions of the public, creating an immersive and electrifying atmosphere. The decision to erect the arena on Mars had been controversial from the start. In the years leading up to its inauguration, the crime rate on Earth had reached alarming levels, prompting governments to seek drastic solutions. In a historic and controversial vote, the United States, supported by a coalition of nations, decided to implement a program that would not only punish criminals, but also serve as a form of entertainment for the masses. The idea was simple but brutal. Prisoners sentenced to long sentences or the death penalty would be sent to Mars, where they would fight to the death. The winner of each bout would advance to the next round, with the promise of freedom as the final prize. For many, it was a chance at redemption. For others, a deferred death sentence. The proposal has sparked intense debate around the world. Human rights groups condemned the practice as barbaric and inhumane, arguing it turned human suffering into a grotesque spectacle. However, the proposal found an avid audience among those who longed for quick and definitive justice, as well as exciting entertainment. Supporters argued that prisoners were being given a second chance, however slim, and that the program would help reduce overcrowding in land-based prisons. The inauguration of the arena, officially called the Domus Bellatorum, or House of Warriors, was an event of epic proportions. broadcast to billions of people on Earth, the first fight was a spectacle of violence and survival, solidifying the arena as a cultural phenomenon. The location on Mars, distant and isolated, provided a sense of separation that helped the audience dehumanize the fighters, seeing them more as characters from a game than as real people. Still, the controversy never completely ceased. Periodically, protests and movements to end the fighting broke out, but they were quickly drowned out by the government and the economic interests underpinning the arena. Over the years, the Domus Bellatorum has become an intrinsic part of society, a grim reminder of the price of justice and the insatiable thirst for entertainment. The crowd roared, their excitement peaking as Kale positioned himself in the center of the arena, his muscles tense and his mind focused. The air seemed to vibrate with the raw energy of the moment, every heavy breath and every heartbeat a prelude to impending violence. He tried to extinguish the deafening clamor, focusing only on the figure emerging from the other side of the arena. His opponent, a tall, imposing man, advanced slowly, each step resounding like thunder in Kale's ears. They called him Garak, a name that evoked fear and respect among the prisoners. His presence was intimidating, his eyes cold and calculating, watching Kale like a predator studying its prey. Garak bore a series of scars that told stories of past battles, each a testament to his brutality and survival. Kale took a deep breath, his thoughts returning to the moments leading up to his own trial. He had fought so many times before, but never with such a high stake. Freedom seemed a distant mirage, but now, more than ever, he needed to believe it was possible. "Stay calm, concentrate," he repeated to himself, trying to suppress the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. As the two men stared at each other, time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity. Garak's gaze was piercing, almost inhuman, and Kale felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that Garak was a veteran of the arena, a merciless fighter, but he also knew that underestimating his own potential would be a fatal mistake. The arena, with its red sand floor and gleaming metal walls, seemed smaller now, squeezed by the tension that filled the space between them. The audience, invisible in the shadows of the stands, shouted and applauded, thirsting for the spectacle that was about to begin. Holographic lights flickered, creating unsettling shadows that danced around the fighters. Suddenly, a high-pitched sound echoed through the arena, signaling the start of combat. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. Kale and Garak moved almost simultaneously, as if they had rehearsed that death choreography. Every muscle in their bodies was primed, every thought focused on survival. Kale kept his eyes fixed on Garak, anticipating his movements, studying every little gesture. The tension in Garak's shoulders, the slight shifting of his weight, all were signs that Kale needed to decipher quickly. He knew that the first exchange of blows would be crucial, determining the pace of the fight. The audience exploded into a collective scream when the two finally clashed, a storm of strength and skill. Kale felt the impact reverberate through his body, a mixture of pain and adrenaline. He blocked Garak's first attack with difficulty, feeling the brute force behind the blow. With a quick movement, Kale counterattacked, his hands finding a target amid the confusion of movements. The arena, which once seemed so vast, was now a claustrophobic battlefield where every step, every decision, could mean the difference between life and death. Kale knew he couldn't afford to make a mistake. Freedom was there, at his fingertips, but first he would have to face and overcome the ruthless warrior who stood before him. The years had passed like a blur to Kale, but he remembered that day vividly. It was a memory that shone in his mind, a beacon of happiness amid the darkness that had become his life. Kale was sitting on the worn leather couch of his modest home, still feeling the fatigue in his muscles and the dull aches from the blows he had received in the last fight. He was a dedicated MMA fighter known for his determination and resilience in the octagon. The victories were many, but so were the sacrifices. At that moment, he enjoyed a rare moment of rest, his eyes half closed, his head leaning back, trying to relax and forget the tension of the last fight. The comfortable silence of the house was broken by the soft sound of the door opening. He looked up and saw Lyra, his wife, entering the room. There was something different about her, a light in her eyes, a restrained excitement that Kale noticed immediately. She approached with a smile she couldn't hide and sat down next to him, holding his hands. "Kale," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I have news." Kale felt a surge of curiosity and concern at the same time. "What is it, love? Is everything okay?" Lyra took a deep breath, her eyes shining with emotion. "We're pregnant, Kale. We're having a baby." For a moment, Kale was silent, absorbing the magnitude of those words. Then an indescribable joy flooded his being. He jumped up, pulling Lyra into a tight hug, feeling his heartbeat in sync with hers. The feeling of happiness was overwhelming, an explosion of emotion that made him laugh and cry at the same time. "A baby? We're going to be parents," he repeated, as if he needed to hear the words to believe them. Lyra laughed, tears of happiness streaming down her face, and Kale kissed her, feeling the salty taste of both their mixed tears. The news brought a new perspective to Kale. He had always fought with unwavering ferocity, but now he had something more to fight for. The idea of a new life, a small being that would depend on him, gave him a new strength, a new reason to continue facing the challenges both inside and outside the octagon. That night, as they talked about the future and made plans, Kale felt a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. He allowed himself to dream, to imagine the sound of childish laughter filling the house, the gentle touch of small hands held in his own. There was hope, there was love, and there was a promise of better days. The months passed quickly, and Kale and Lyra found themselves increasingly anxious about the baby's arrival. Every doctor's appointment, every examination, was a step closer to a new life that approached with joy and expectation. And then came the day of ultrasound to find out the sex of the baby. Kale and Lyra were in the waiting room of the clinic, hands clasped, exchanging complicit looks and nervous smiles. When they were called, they entered the examination room, where the doctor greeted them with a welcoming smile. Lyra lay down on the stretcher, and Kale positioned himself next to her, holding her hand. The doctor applied the cold gel to Lyra's abdomen and began moving the transducer over her skin. The ultrasound image appeared on the screen, showing the little being growing inside Lyra. Kale's heart raced, and he shook his wife's hand harder, his gaze fixed on the screen. "Let's see if we can find out the sex of the baby today," said the doctor, concentrating on the images. A few moments of suspense passed, until she smiled and announced, "Congratulations, you are going to have a girl." Lyra laughed, tears of happiness welling up again. Kale felt a surge of emotion wash over him, a mixture of joy and love that made him smile broadly. He leaned in to kiss Lyra, feeling a deep and indescribable connection to the life that was forming. When they returned home, the conversation naturally turned to the choice of name. They sat on the couch, their eyes shining with excitement. Lyra leaned back in Kale's arms, and together they began to suggest names, each carrying a dream, a hope. "I've always liked the name Ava," Lyra said, looking at Kale with a smile. "It's simple, but beautiful." Kale smiled, gently stroking her hair. "Ava, I like that. But what do you think of Maya? It is strong and delicate at the same time." Lyra pondered for a moment, shaking her head slightly. "Maya is beautiful, and it has a special meaning. It represents something precious and rare." Kale squeezed her a little tighter. "So, how about Ava Maya? It combines the two names we like and seems perfect for our little one." Lyra smiled broadly. "Ava Maya, it's perfect." She put her hand on her belly, feeling a deep connection with the daughter growing inside her. "I can't wait to meet her." Kale leaned over and gently kissed Lyra's belly. "Ava Maya, we love you so much, and we can't wait to hold you in our arms." From that day on, they began to refer to the baby by name, making her even more real in their lives. Kale found new strength in every training stroke, in every fight, fueled by the idea of protecting and caring for her daughter. He knew he needed to be the best father possible, a man Ava Maya could look up to and love. The sound of the bell that marked the end of the fight filled the arena, and Kale slowly stood up, feeling the sweat and blood mingle on his skin. He looked at his opponent lying on the ground, his chest rising and falling heavily. Another victory, another step towards your dream. But that night, victory tasted even sweeter. for he knew that the recognition he had long sought was finally within his grasp. After years of dedication and hard-fought battles on the MMA circuit, Kale had finally been offered a contract with one of the biggest companies in the business. The proposal came after a string of impressive victories, which showed the world his skill, strength, and determination. The news came like lightning, bringing with it a promise of stability and success, which would be key to the arrival of his daughter. I was at home, resting after a particularly difficult fight, when the phone rang. As he answered, he heard the formal but friendly voice of a company representative. "Kale, this is Thomas Montgomery from the Global MMA League. We have been following their struggles and are impressed with their performance. We would like to offer a contract with our organization. How do you feel about discussing the details in a meeting?" Kale could hardly believe what he was hearing. He looked at Lyra, who was standing next to him, and saw the same gleam of emotion and pride in her eyes. His voice trembling with emotion, he replied, "Of course, Mr. Montgomery. It will be an honor." The meeting took place days later, and Kale walked into the company's office with her head held high, feeling a mixture of nervousness and excitement. Thomas Montgomery welcomed him warmly, guiding him to a meeting room where the details of the contract were discussed. The deal included a substantial salary, as well as sponsorships and opportunities to fight at the world's biggest MMA events. When Kale finally signed the contract, it felt like a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He had worked so hard to get there, sacrificed so much, and now it was all paying off. As he left the office, he felt a new surge of motivation and determination. The image of Lyra and Ava Maya in his mind propelled him further. He wanted to provide the best possible life for his family, and this contract was a big step in that direction. The following days were a mix of intense training and moments of celebration with Lyra. They began to make plans for the future, dreaming of a larger house, a safe and comfortable environment in which to raise Ava Maya. Kale knew that despite all the struggles and challenges, he was on the right track. The moment has finally arrived. After months of waiting, planning, and dreaming, Kale and Lyra were in the hospital, awaiting the arrival of their daughter. Kale held Lyra's hand firmly, feeling nervousness and emotion overwhelm her body. The surrounding environment seemed to dissolve, leaving only the two of them and the expectation of the new beginning. Lyra, lying on the hospital bed, was breathing deeply, following the doctor's instructions. The labor had been long and exhausting, but Lyra's determination and strength never wavered. Kale stood beside her, offering words of encouragement, but also feeling a growing anxiety. He had never felt so vulnerable and at the same time so full of hope. Finally, the sound of Ava Maya's first cry echoed through the delivery room. It was a fragile but powerful sound, charged with life and promise. Kale felt a wave of relief and joy wash over her body, and tears of happiness flowed freely down her face. He looked at Lyra, who was also crying, the most radiant smile he had ever seen on her lips. "She's here, Lyra. Our Ava Maya is here," Kale said, her voice choked with emotion. The nurse placed the baby in Lyra's arms, and Kale leaned over to see the little face for the first time. Ava Maya was perfect, with her curious little eyes and rosy skin. Kale gently touched her daughter's little hand, feeling the fragility and strength in that little being. His heart was filled with immediate and unconditional love. "Hi, my little one. It's me, your daddy," Kale whispered, feeling a deep and immediate connection to her daughter. Lyra looked at Kale, her eyes shining with tears and happiness. "She's beautiful, Kale. We are so blessed." Kale nodded, unable to find suitable words to express what he felt. He sat down next to Lyra, wrapped the two of them in a tender, protective embrace. At that moment, all the effort, the struggles, and the difficulties they had faced seemed worth it. They had Ava Maya, and she was the center of their lives now. The following days were a mixture of discoveries and adaptations. Kale and Lyra took turns caring for the baby, each moment a new experience of love and learning. Kale spent hours cradling Ava Maya in his arms, singing lullabies and watching every little movement, every smile, and every expression. He felt a new responsibility, a new inner strength. Ava Maya was the future, the reason he would fight even more fiercely inside and outside the octagon. Every workout, every fight, now had a greater purpose. He wanted to be the hero his daughter could look up to, someone she could always count on. The following months passed quickly, each bringing new achievements and challenges for Kale. He dedicated himself tirelessly to training and competitions, always with the image of Ava Maia and Lyra in his mind. His love for them and the desire to provide a better life for his family drove him every day. Ava Maia was growing up fast, a curious and full of life girl. Her eyes shone with the same intensity as her mother's, and Kale found in her a constant source of inspiration and joy. He made sure to be present in every important moment of his life, balancing the exhausting routine of training with precious family moments. Kale excelled in the global MMA league, winning back-to-back victories and earning respect and admiration in the MMA world. His determination and skill in the octagon were unquestionable, and soon he found himself competing for the title of champion of his weight category. The title fight was a monumental event, broadcast to millions of viewers around the world. On fight night, the stadium was packed, the energy in the air was palpable. Kale entered the octagon with a serenity that masked the storm of emotions within him. He knew that everything he had achieved, all the sacrifices, culminated in that moment. Lyra and Ava Maia were in the audience, their presences giving her extra strength. Kale's opponent was a renowned fighter, known for his aggressiveness and impeccable technique. The fight was a real battle, a duel of strength and strategy that kept the audience on the edge of their seats. Every stroke exchanged, every defensive move, was charged with tension and expectation. Kale, moved by the love and responsibility he felt for his family, fought with a ferocity and precision that left the audience ecstatic. At a decisive moment, he managed to land a perfect blow, knocking down his opponent with a full cross and after his fall a sequence of punches. The referee intervened, declaring Kale the winner by TKO. The stadium erupted in cheers and shouts of euphoria. Kale, panting and sweaty, raised his arms in victory, feeling a wave of relief and joy invade his body. He approached the octagon railing, where Lyra and Ava Maia were waiting for him. With a beaming smile, he held his daughter's small hand, gently pulling her into the octagon. Lyra came up right behind, and the three hugged in the center of the ring. The moment was captured by cameras around the world, a perfect portrait of triumph and love. Kale kissed Lyra and then looked at Ava Maia, her eyes shining with pride and happiness. "This title is for you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Everything I do is for our family." Ava Maia, still holding the championship belt that her father had just won, looked at him with admiration. "Dad, you're the best," she said, smiling. From that day on, Kale became a legend in the MMA world, not only for his skills in the octagon, but also for his dedication and love of family. He continued to train and compete, but always found time to be with Lyra and Ava Maia, participating in every stage of their lives. Everything went well. Kale the champion had defended his title for 7 more times and had the 8th defense scheduled for 2 months from now. But Kale's world has been shattered by the tragedy that has befallen his family. Ava Maia's brutal murder left deep and irreparable marks on her heart. He felt like he was in a nightmare from which he could not wake up, consumed by pain and anger. The pain Kale felt after Ava Maia's brutal death was like a devastating storm that shattered her heart. He was devastated, unable to find solace anywhere. Every thought about her daughter was a sharp knife that cut into her soul, every happy memory turning into unbearable agony. The discovery that Ava Maia had been abused before she was brutally murdered was an even crueler blow. Kale felt helpless, consumed by a mixture of deep sadness and indomitable anger. He struggled to understand how something so terrible could happen to a child so innocent and full of life. The day the police discovered the body, after Ava had been missing for hours to the despair of her parents, but the discovery was even more shocking. That sweet and caring girl was brutally injured and dead. Lyra, equally devastated, found refuge in the grief shared with Kale. The two held on to each other, finding solace in each other's presence, but the shadow of Ava Maia's loss hung over them like a black cloud. The days that followed were a blur of tears, loneliness, and despair. Kale withdrew from the outside world, closing himself in his own pain. He avoided the arenas, the workouts, anything that reminded him of the world that had once been bright and full of promise. His mind was becoming disturbed, while the investigations went on in full swing. The support of friends and fellow fighters was well-intentioned, but Cale felt distant, isolated in his own grief. He knew he needed to face reality, that life went on despite his overwhelming pain, but each day was a battle to find a reason to continue. In the depths of his being, a flame still burned. It was the memory of the love he felt for Ava Maya, a love that could not be erased by tragedy. He clung to his memory, promising himself that he would find a way through the darkness somehow. After their daughter's funeral, Cale and Lyra could barely find solace in each other. Each day was a battle against the hopelessness and overwhelming sadness that hung over them. The house, once filled with childish laughter and scattered toys, has become a quiet and gloomy place. Cale closed himself to the outside world, plunging into a sea of turbulent emotions. He blamed himself for not having protected Ava Maya, for not having been there to stop her from that terrible fate. The anger he felt was paralyzing, a burning bonfire that burned in his chest day and night and let the hatred for the figure who had done it grow frighteningly inside him. Lyra, equally devastated, sought strength and faith in the happy memories she shared with her daughter. She tried to be a pillar of support for Cale, even as she faced her own emotional storm. Their lives had been forever transformed by an unspeakable act of violence. The atmosphere at the police station was charged with expectation when Cale and Lyra were called to a meeting with the investigators responsible for Ava Maya's case. They entered the interrogation room, nervous and hopeful for some news about the fate of their daughter. "Please sit down. We have some important updates on Ava Maya's case," Detective Johnson began, earnestly. Cale and Lyra's gazes met, eager for any information that might bring some peace to the pain they had carried since Ava Maya's disappearance. "We have made significant progress in the investigation. Security camera footage in the park where Ava Maya was last seen led us to the suspect," the detective continued. Do you know who it was?" Lyra asked, her voice trembling with expectation and fear. "Yes. We've identified the man responsible for Ava Maya's murder. His name is John Doe. He has a criminal history and was located in a neighboring town. We're about to arrest him," Detective Johnson explained, with a tone of deep understanding for the pain Cale and Lyra were going through. "Oh my God." Finally, Lyra let out a hiccup of relief mixed with pain. Cale looked at the detective with eyes full of determination. "Thank you for not giving up on her. Please do whatever it takes to make him pay for what he did." Detective Johnson nodded, aware of the urgency and intensity of Cale and Lyra's emotions. "We will keep you informed about the next steps. You can go home now and get some rest." Cale and Lyra stood up, still stunned by the revelation but feeling a small ray of hope in the bleak horizon they had faced since Ava Maya's disappearance. "We'll make it, love. Let's get justice for our little girl," Lyra said, firmly holding Cale's hand. He nodded, his eyes reflecting determination and a silent promise that they would never let Ava Maya's sacrifice be forgotten. After the detailed investigation of the police and the identification of John Doe as the one responsible for the brutal murder of Ava Maya, the case was brought to trial. The courtroom was filled with anticipation and tension when the proceedings began. The prosecutor presented the evidence meticulously, from security camera footage to the testimony of key witnesses. Cale and Lyra were present at each session of the trial, seeking justice for their daughter and hoping that the judicial system would play its part. However, John Doe's defense was relentless. His lawyer, known for his skill in high-complexity cases and powerful connections, exploited every loophole in the evidence presented by the prosecution. He questioned the validity of the evidence, suggested inconsistencies in the testimony, and tried to discredit the accounts that incriminated his client. Despite Cale and Lyra's expectations, the jury was eventually persuaded by the defense's strategy. After hours of deliberation, the verdict was announced. John Doe was acquitted of all charges. The courtroom was silent, broken only by the muffled sound of Lyra sobbing and Cale clenching her fists in pent-up anger. As a cruel blow, the justice they so sought was denied. John Doe, a wealthy and powerful man, had escaped the consequences of his actions due to his influence and resources. Cale looked at Lyra, his face a mixture of despair and indignation. She stared back at him, her eyes filled with tears of helplessness and pain. "This can't be happening," Cale muttered, his voice choked by the weight of the injustice they had just witnessed. Lyra gripped his hand tightly, seeking comfort in each other's presence in the face of brutal reality. "He can't get away with what he did to our daughter," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. Cale felt a burning fire within him. The feeling of powerlessness was overwhelming, but he knew he couldn't give up. Ava Maya deserved justice, and he was determined to find her, no matter what the cost. As they left the courthouse, Cale and Lyra knew the battle wasn't over yet. The pain of losing her daughter remained, now mixed with a renewed determination to seek justice in other possible ways. Back in the house that was once a haven of joy and hope, Cale and Lyra found themselves in a silence charged with pain and indignation. The verdict of the court echoed as a final blow to their hearts already torn by the loss of Ava Maya. Sitting in the room, the heavy atmosphere reflected the weight of injustice they had just witnessed. Cale was restless, his thoughts immersed in the image of John Doe. The man who had escaped deserved punishment. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the face of her daughter's killer, now free by the loopholes of the law that was supposed to protect the innocent. Lyra sat next to him, her eyes red with tears. She knew how much that decision affected Cale, feeling the same mixture of anger and despair within herself. "How can this be fair?" Cale muttered, his voice heavy with bitterness. "He took our daughter from us, and now she is free." Lyra held his hand affectionately, seeking to comfort him with gentle gestures. "I know, my love," she said in a choked voice, "but we need to find a way to move forward." Cale stood up abruptly, the energy contained within him exploding in an impetus of determination. "I can't just leave it at that," he said, his voice now firm and resolute. "John Doe may have escaped justice today, but I swear by all that is most sacred that he will not escape me." Lyra looked at him with surprise mixed with concern. "What do you mean, Cale?" He turned to her, his eyes sparkling with an intensity she'd never seen before. "I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure he pays for what he did. No matter how long it takes, no matter what I have to sacrifice, he'll pay." Lyra swallowed hard, understanding the depth of Cale's determination. She knew he wasn't just speaking out of the emotion of the moment. He was taking an oath, a promise he would dedicate himself to keeping. "Cale, you need to be careful. He is powerful. He has connections." "I know," interrupted Cale, his voice now calm and calculated. "But I can't ignore that. If I don't do anything, Ava Maya won't get justice." Lyra stood up too, walking up to him and hugging him tightly. "We'll be in this together, Cale. Always." He hugged her back, feeling strengthened by her support. "We'll find a way," Lyra murmured. "Let's find a way." The darkness of night enveloped the city as Cale moved with quiet determination toward John Doe's secluded mansion. The shadows welcomed him as he approached, each step echoing his relentless determination. The icy air seemed to freeze his thoughts, focused only on one thing: revenge. With a racing heart, he remembered Ava Maya's innocent eyes, the smile he would never see again, the justice that failed. It was a mixture of hatred and pain that drove his movements as he scaled the property wall. The mansion, imposing and silent, looked like a monument to John Doe's impunity. Cale crept forward through the manicured gardens, his meticulous steps guided by the darkness and grim determination that consumed him. Finally, he found a window without bars, a stealthy entrance to the palace of the culprit. With trained skill, he slipped through the window, finding himself in a dark and silent corridor. Each breath was a reminder of what I was about to do. He heard distant footsteps, indicating that John Doe was home. His heart pounded against his chest as he approached the main office, where he assumed he would find his target. And there he was, sitting at his luxurious desk as if he were a king on his throne. John Doe, the man who took Ava Maya's life and escaped the clutches of justice. Cale felt the blood pulse in his ears as he approached, each step a dance between revenge and fate. John Doe raised his eyes in surprise when he saw Cale emerge from the shadows, his face marked by the fierce determination that consumed him. A moment of recognition passed between them before Cale struck, hatred boiling like lava inside his torn soul. The punches and blows fell like a gale of delayed justice. The sound of flesh against flesh mingled with the scream of John Doe. Each blow was an explosion of pent-up anger, each breath an echo of the suffering Ava Maya endured. When the fighting ceased, John Doe lay on the ground, a grim testament to Cale's revenge. The air was charged with pain and bitter realization. He looked at his blood-stained hands, the sight of John Doe swooning before him a mixture of triumph and horror. Sirens echoed in the distance, bringing with them the inevitable. Cale knew it had come to an end. He took a deep breath, accepting the fate that he himself had sealed with his actions. When police burst through the door, they found Cale standing next to John Doe's body. He did not resist arrest, his hands now handcuffed as final testimony to his revenge. On the day of Cale's trial, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense and charged with emotions. Cale stood before the judge, his gaze fixed on an undefined point in front of him. Lyra's silent presence, sitting in the front row, was a reflection of the deep pain she had carried since the loss of Ava Maya. Silent tears streamed down her face, witnesses to her unfathomable grief at the tragic turns their lives had taken. The prosecutor presented a meticulous and incisive case, outlining the events that led to Cale's act against John Doe. The evidence was clear and incontrovertible, the witnesses firm in their testimony. The defense attorney, in turn, tried to paint a picture of a desperate man, motivated by the indescribable suffering that the loss of his daughter had inflicted. In the midst of legal arguments, the judge finally turned to Cale, his gravelly voice echoing through the room. "Cale, you've been charged with felony murder. As a defendant, you have the right to make a statement before sentencing." Cale looked at Lyra for a moment, his eyes meeting hers, charged with sadness and pain. He took a deep breath, gathering the words to express the magnitude of his regret and his pain. "There is no regret for what I did. I lost my daughter. My light and the justice of this court failed by selling out. But what I did will not bring justice to Ava Maya. I just wish justice for her." Lyra held on tightly to the bench, trying to hold back the crying that threatened to consume her completely. The image of Ava Maya, his adored daughter, was a palpable presence in the room, even physically absent. The judge listened intently before turning to pronounce sentence, his final words sealing Cale's fate. Based on the facts presented and the seriousness of the crime committed, this court determines that Cale be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lyra let out a sob of anguish, her hand covering her mouth to drown out the sound of her pain. She felt as if the ground had been ripped from under her feet, leaving her adrift in a sea of despair and desolation. The judge's voice echoed far away as Cale was escorted out of the room, his footsteps marking the end of a life he knew and the beginning of another he had never imagined. Lyra remained where she was, tears flowing freely now, a silent lament for the loss of her daughter and the inevitable separation from her husband. In the painful silence of the courtroom, she felt the loneliness and emptiness of an uncertain future stretching out before her. The impacts of the tragedy that enveloped Cale reverberated intensely in the world of MMA. His name, once synonymous with victory and glory in the rings, was now tarnished by a heinous crime and a harsh sentence. The news spread like wildfire on dry straw, echoing in the halls of gyms, on social networks, and in the hearts of fans who once fervently applauded him. Meanwhile, Cale was transferred to a maximum security prison. The shock of the new reality was overwhelming. In the cramped and gloomy cell, he faced loneliness and the crushing weight of his own actions. Each day was a battle to adapt to his new life behind bars. On a sunny morning, Cale walked through the prison yard, surrounded by curious glances and murmurs. The incident that led him there was on everyone's mind, and he could feel the weight of the silent judgment that accompanied it. "Hey, you're Cale, right? The fighter?" Cale nodded with a nod, avoiding the piercing gaze of the man who was now watching him intently. "Damn, I heard about what happened. Heavy, brother." Cale did not answer, his gaze lost on the horizon beyond the bars. "Hey, Cale, MMA won't be the same without you, man," said another approaching. Cale turned slowly to face the other inmate, his expression a mixture of resignation and pain. "Yeah, I seem to have made a mess of my life. Welcome to the club, brother. We've all made a mess here. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. A guard approached Kale, indicating that it was time to return to the cell. He looked once more into the courtyard, where men of different histories and destinies shared the same confined space. Come on, time to go back inside. Kale nodded silently, following the guard back into the monotonous routine of the prison. In the days that followed, Kale found himself embroiled in the complex dynamics of prison life. He learned to stay alert against daily threats, while seeking a fragile balance between survival and introspection. In moments of solitude, he would revisit the memories of Ava Maya, his adored daughter, searching for meaning or redemption in the depths of his tormented soul. Each visit from Lyra, his devastated wife, was a painful reminder of what he had lost and the irreparable consequences of his thoughtless actions. Kale, I don't know what to say. This is not the life we planned. Kale looked at her, eyes full of sadness and regret. I'm trying, Lyra. Every day. How are you? Really? Kale nodded with a weak smile, his hands pressed against the cold glass separating them. I'm sorry for everything. We'll get through this, Kale. I promise. Kale nodded with a weak smile, his hands pressed against the cold glass separating them. I'm sorry for everything. We'll get through this, Kale. I promise. And so, between the concrete walls and the endless hours, Kale faced his journey of redemption and atonement. Each day was a step toward a deeper understanding of yourself and the consequences of your choices. In prison, Kale soon found a way to maintain his connection to the world he once dominated, the world of fighting. As the years slowly passed, he immersed himself in physical and mental training, turning his cell into a makeshift training space. With meticulously planned routines, Kale used every moment of freedom within the concrete confines to hone his skills and share his knowledge with other prisoners. At first, some looked at him with suspicion, but gradually Kale's skill as a fighter and instructor began to earn respect. He taught not only fighting techniques, but also the principles of discipline, emotional control, and mutual respect that he had learned throughout his MMA career, although he himself had failed in this regard. Among the prisoners, Kale gained a reputation as a mentor and silent leader. He was in demand not only for his skill in martial arts, but also for his wise advice and balanced outlook on life. In the moments of training, the tensions of prison life seemed to fade, replaced by the intense concentration and spirit of camaraderie that Kale cultivated among his makeshift students. Lyra continued to visit him regularly, despite the difficulties and emotional burden that each encounter carried. She admired Kale's determination to find a way to redemption and hope even in such adverse circumstances. Their encounters at the visitation were an oasis of normalcy in a sea of monotony and despair. Meanwhile, on the outside, the MMA world continued to evolve, with new champions emerging and rivalries intensifying. Kale, however, was distant from that reality, focused on his own personal growth and the impact he could have within prison walls. As the years piled on, Kale found a renewed sense of purpose within the prison. He saw each workout as an opportunity for redemption, not only for himself but also for those who were willing to learn from him. His body hardened by time, and his mind sharpened by experience became silent witnesses to his ongoing journey of transformation. Between the cold corridors and the bars that limited his freedom, Kale found a form of relative peace. He knew that each day in prison was a constant reminder of the consequences of his actions, but also an opportunity to become someone better than he was before. It was after a few years that rumors about a new arena began to spread like smoke among the inmates. Kale, ever mindful of what was going on around him, listened to the growing whispers about a place where inmates could fight for the chance to regain their freedom. It was a tantalizing promise, a chance at redemption amid the monotony of life behind bars. One day, during a visit from Lyra, Kale could no longer contain his curiosity. Lyra, have you heard about this arena? Lyra hesitated for a moment, her eyes meeting Kale's, worried about what that conversation might trigger. Yes, Kale. People have been talking about it out here. But you're not thinking about that, are you? Kale smiled slightly, his gaze distant for an instant before returning to her. I don't know, Lyra. Maybe it's a chance. a chance to get out of here. Lyra held her hands through the cold glass separating them, her expression a mixture of understanding and concern. Kale, you have already suffered so much. I don't know if it's the right way. From what they say, only one will get out alive. It's cruel. Kale nodded, his mind spinning with possibilities and doubts. He knew that the arena could mean an opportunity to get out of that place, but it also posed a significant risk, both physical and emotional. I know, Lyra. It's just something to think about. Lyra sighed, anguish visible in her eyes as she struggled to find the right words. Please don't just do this for me. Think about what is best for you. Kale gently shook Lyra's hands, silently promising her that he would consider all options carefully. I promise, Lyra. I'll think about it. And so, amid the echoes of rumors in prison and the uncertainty of the future, Kale faced a decision that could shape the course of her life within the confining walls. As the days passed and the arena became an ever closer reality, he knew he would need to find an answer for himself, an answer that not only reflected his desire for freedom, but also his quest for redemption. After a few months, the rumor turned out to be true. Lyra, with a serious expression, found Kale in the living room. Kale, construction has begun. He looked at her, not immediately understanding. What constructions? The space arena. It's really happening. Despite the protests, the project is moving forward. It seems a lot of people want to see that. Kale felt a mixture of emotions. The idea of a space arena, a place where he could fight for his freedom, ignited a flame of hope in his chest. So it's really real? Lyra nodded, watching her husband's reaction. Yes, it's real. But Kale, that's dangerous. You know it won't be easy. He couldn't contain a smile, something he hadn't done for a long time. I know, Lyra, but it's a chance. Maybe it's the only chance I have to get out of it. She held his hands, her words charged with concern and love. Kale, you've faced so many battles. I don't want to lose you either. Kale shook Lyra's hands, feeling her strength and determination break through the cold glass. I will fight, Lyra. For us. By Ava Maya. I have to do this. I will be released. I will return home. She sighed, her eyes welling with tears. Then I'll be here, waiting for you, and cheering with all my might. Kale smiled, feeling refreshed. For the first time in a long time, he felt he had a direction, a clear purpose. He knew the journey would be difficult, but the possibility of redemption and freedom made his heart beat faster. In the following days, news of the construction of the space arena spread rapidly through the prison. Kale began to train more intensely, his determination visible in every movement. He knew he would need to be at the peak of his physical and mental fitness to face the challenges that lay ahead. As the construction of the arena progressed, the murmurs of the inmates became more audible, filled with anxiety and hope. Many saw the arena as an opportunity to escape the confines of life, to prove their worth and maybe, just maybe, win freedom. Many had nothing to lose and saw it as a spark of hope. For Kale, the arena was not just a chance for freedom, but a way to honor her daughter's memory and find redemption for past mistakes. He prepared for the battle of his life, determined to win not only for those he loved, but also for himself. And so, the promise of the space arena became more and more real, a light at the end of the dark prison tunnel. Kale was ready to face any adversity, moved by hope and the will to fight for a better future. After about a year of rumors and growing expectations, the news finally reached the prisoner's ears. On a sunny morning, the guards gathered everyone in the courtyard of the prison. The tension in the air was palpable, each prisoner eager to hear the announcement. "Listen up, everyone," began one of the guards, his steady voice echoing through the courtyard. "The space arena is ready. We're here to find out who wants to participate. This is a chance to fight for freedom. Anyone interested, speak up now." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of a single hand rising into the air. It was Kale. He stood, determination shining in his eyes. "I'm in," he said, his voice firm and clear. For a moment, there was a respectful silence. Then a wave of applause and shouts of encouragement exploded around him. The other prisoners, admiring his courage and determination, began to enthusiastically encourage him. "Go, Kale. You can do it. Show them, champ." The guards jotted down Kale's data as he stood, feeling the energy and support of the other prisoners. He knew this was the opportunity he was waiting for, a chance to fight for freedom and redemption. As he handed over his information, one of the guards looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and respect. "Good luck, Kale. You will need it." Kale just nodded, determined. "I know. I'm ready." That moment marked the beginning of a new phase in Kale's life. He felt more motivated than ever, determined to seize this unique opportunity. With the applause of the prisoners still ringing in his ears, he returned to his cell, knowing that every workout, every internal battle, and every sacrifice would be worth it. In the following days, Kale redoubled his training efforts. He revisited his old routines, honing each technique and strengthening his body and mind for the challenges ahead. The other prisoners watched him with admiration, some even asking to train alongside him, seeking to learn from the experienced fighter. The space arena was getting closer and closer, and Kale was prepared to face whatever came his way. He carried in his heart the memory of Ava Maya, the hope of Lyra, and the determination of a man who knew the true meaning of fighting for life. After a few more months of intense preparation, the day has finally come. The volunteer prisoners were rounded up to be taken to a spaceship bound for Mars. Excitement and nervousness permeated the air as each of them faced the reality of an uncertain and dangerous journey. Kale was called for one last visit with Lyra. "I knew this would be the hardest time before I boarded the ship." When he entered the living room, he found Lyra already waiting, her eyes full of tears and worry. She tried to smile, but the sadness in her eyes was evident. "Kale, I don't know what to say." He reached over and held her hands, feeling the warmth and familiarity of her touch. "Lyra, I know this is hard, but I need to do this, not only for myself, but for us." Tears flowed down her face, and her voice trembled. "Promise me something, Kale. Promise you'll stay alive. That will come back to me." Kale wiped Lyra's tears with his thumb, trying to keep his voice steady. "I promise, Lyra. I will fight with all my strength to come back. And when I come back, everything will be different." She nodded, despite the visible pain in her eyes. "I believe in you. I've always believed." He smiled, despite the weight of the moment. "And I would never have made it this far without you. You gave me strength when I had none left." They were silent for a moment, just enjoying each other's presence. Finally, the guard entered the room, indicating that the time of the visit was ending. Lyra shook Kale's hands one last time, her voice charged with emotion. "I'll wait for you, Kale. Every day. Stay alive." Kale nodded, determined. "I will, Lyra. I promise." They said goodbye with one last bond of love and hope before Kale departed into the unknown. With a heavy heart, he followed the guard to the boarding area, where hundreds of other prisoners were already gathered. The spaceship awaited, an imposing, metallic structure that symbolized both hope and danger. Kale took a deep breath, feeling the mixture of fear and determination throb in her veins. When everyone was ready, the guards began to lead them into the ship. Kale looked down at the earth one last time, thinking of Lyra and the promise she had made. He knew the road would be arduous, but he was determined to honor his words. Inside the craft, the prisoners settled into their seats, feeling the increasing vibration as the engines prepared for takeoff. Kale closed her eyes for a moment, visualizing Lyra's face and Ava Maya's memory. That was the emotional fuel I needed to take on any challenge. The countdown began, and soon the ship shook as it launched into space. Kale felt gravity recede, and with it, a new chapter of her life began. He was going to Mars, to the arena, for the chance to fight for the freedom and redemption he longed for. And as the ship pulled away from Earth, Kale knew that every second brought him closer to his destination. He was ready to face anything, moved by love and the promise to return to those who mattered most. The journey to Mars was long and silent, each prisoner immersed in his own thoughts. When they finally reached the Red Planet, Kale and the other volunteers were escorted off the ship. They stepped onto Martian soil with a sense of unreality, the vast arid and reddish landscapes stretching out before them. The facilities built for the prisoners were functional and secure, a combination of advanced technology and austerity needed to maintain order. Each prisoner was assigned a simple room, equipped with the basics: a bed, a desk, and a space to train. The environment was hostile, but Kale felt a strange sense of renewal, as if Mars itself represented a new beginning. In the days that followed, the training routine intensified. Stern instructors, many of them former military personnel, guided the prisoners through rigorous training. The sessions included hand-to-hand combat, survival techniques, and endurance exercises. Kale, with his MMA experience, quickly stood out, earning the respect of both the instructors and the other prisoners. During a break in training, Kale sat on the edge of a crater, looking at the Martian horizon. One of the prisoners, a man named Victor, approached. "Kale, I heard you were a great fighter back on Earth. Do you think that will help you here?" Kale turned around, assessing Victor. "Maybe, but here, it's not just about being the best fighter. It's about surviving and having the will to fight to the end." Victor nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think any of us really have a chance to get out of here?" "We all have a chance," Kale replied, his voice firm. "But we need to believe in it and be willing to give it everything we have." The weeks passed quickly. The atmosphere among the prisoners was tense and fraught with expectation. They were aware that the arena was not only a chance for freedom, but also a bloody spectacle to entertain the masses. Kale, however, remained focused, using every free moment to train and mentally prepare for what was to come. On a particularly cold night, Kale stood in her room in silence, letting Lyra's last words echo in her mind. He was more determined than ever. Everything was approaching, and with it, the opportunity to strive for something greater than himself. Finally, the day has come. The arena, a colossal structure of metal and glass, was ready for the first combat. The prisoners were gathered, and the tension in the air was almost palpable. Kale took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline pulse in her veins. He looked around, seeing the determined faces of his companions. This was the moment everyone was waiting for. As the arena gates opened, Kale entered with steady steps, the roar of the crowds echoing around him. He was ready to fight, to face any opponent that came up. And most of all, he was ready to honor his promise to return to Lyra and find the redemption he had long sought. The fighters were gathered in a large room before the start of the tournament. The walls were dark and cold metal, reflecting the gravity of the situation. The organizers of the event, dressed in imposing uniforms, walked to the center of the room, ready to give the final instructions. "This will be a knockout tournament," one of the organizers began, his voice echoing through the room. "To advance, you must kill your opponent. There are no exceptions. This is the only rule." Kale felt a lump form in his throat as the words reverberated in his mind. He looked around and saw that the other fighters were equally tense. The brutality of the arena was now abundantly clear. The fighters were sent back to their quarters, where they waited to be called up again. Kale waited in a meditative state, trying to catch screams echoing in the arena above his head, when he was interrupted by a voice that told him, "You're next." The gates of the arena opened, revealing a vast, bloody field. Kale took a deep breath, trying to control the adrenaline that pulsed in his veins. He knew he needed to keep a cool head and sharp instincts. As soon as he stepped onto the arena floor, the screams of the crowd erupted around him. His first opponent was a burly man with a fierce expression. They stared at each other for a moment, assessing each other, before launching into combat. Kale quickly dominated the fight, utilizing his MMA skills to immobilize the opponent. The man fought desperately, but Kale was ruthless, using every move with precision and efficiency. When the opponent was down and exhausted, a dais rose in the center of the arena, revealing a bright and menacing axe. Kale reached for the gun, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. He took the axe, but something inside him refused to go through with the final act. He turned around, letting the axe fall to the ground. "I'm not going to kill you," Kale said, her voice firm. "That's not part of who I am." But when Kale turned his back on his opponent, he heard the sound of quick steps and a war cry. He turned around in time to see the man standing up, wielding the axe with an expression of hatred and despair. Kale reacted instinctively. He dodged the blow and grabbed the opponent's arm, twisting it hard. The axe fell from the man's hands, and Kale picked it up before it could reach the ground. With a quick and precise movement, he drove the blade into the opponent's chest, ending the fight definitively. The momentary silence in the arena was quickly replaced by a roar of approval from the crowd. Kale looked at the man's body, feeling a mixture of relief and disgust. He didn't want to kill, but the cruel reality of the arena left him no other choice. He raised his head, facing the crowd and the organizers, his expression determined. He knew that in order to survive and achieve his freedom, he would have to face many other brutal challenges. And through it all, the promise to return to Lyra and honor Ava Maya's memory was what kept him on his feet, ready for the next battle. As the arena gates closed behind him, Kale knew that each fight brought him closer to his goal. The arena was a place of death and suffering, but it was also their only chance at redemption, and he was determined not to squander this opportunity, no matter what lay ahead. Kale continued to advance in the tournament, eliminating opponent after opponent. Each match was a test of his skill, endurance, and determination. Despite growing fatigue and accumulated wounds, he maintained an unshakable confidence, moved by the promise of freedom and the memory of Ava Maya. The arena was a brutal and unforgiving field. The fighting was intense and unremitting, the prisoners being pitted against each other in bloody battles. Kale knew that he could not falter. Every mistake could be fatal. Even so, he faced each new opponent with fierce determination. On one of those nights, while resting in his cell, Kale reflected on the journey there. Tiredness was visible in his aching muscles and the cuts that marked his skin, but he felt that he was getting closer and closer to his goal. The sound of footsteps in the corridor took him out of his thoughts. A guard appeared, informing him that the next fight would be soon. Kale stood up, taking a deep breath to calm her nerves. He walked to the staging area, where other fighters were waiting for their turn. Some had desperate looks and were visibly injured with no condition of having another fight. Others were resigned to fate. Kale, however, kept his eyes fixed on the goal. He knew that he was not only fighting for himself, but also for Lyra and the memory of his daughter. When he entered the arena again, the roar of the crowd filled his ears. He felt energized by adrenaline, even though he knew that the next fight would be as challenging as the previous ones. His opponent was a tall, muscular man with scars that testified to past battles. They stared at each other for a moment, before advancing towards each other. The fight began intense, with both exchanging quick and powerful blows. Kale felt every movement, every impact, but his mind was focused and clear. He used his MMA experience to dodge attacks and respond with precision. Time seemed to stretch, every second an eternity as they faced each other in the center of the arena. Finally, Kale found an opening. With an agile movement, he delivered a well-aimed blow that knocked down his opponent. The man fell, panting and defeated. Kale was exhausted, but victorious, and with one well-aimed blow of a sword pierced the opponent's heart. The crowd cheered, celebrating yet another impressive victory. Back in his cell, Kale allowed himself a moment of relief. He knew the tournament wasn't over yet, but each victory brought him closer to his goal. He thought of Lyra, of the promise he had made, and it gave him strength to continue. As the tournament reached its final stages, Kale prepared for the toughest matches of his life. But he was ready. The arena, with all its brutality, had become the field where he would seek redemption and a free future. And Kale was determined to win this victory, no matter what lay ahead. Kale felt a different tension in the air. As he was led into the arena, he learned that his next opponent would be Victor, the man he had known and respected throughout their time together in prison. As they entered the arena, the two faced each other, aware of the cruel irony of fate that pitted them against each other. The crowds in the seats roared with anticipation, eager for the spectacle of blood and violence. Kale and Victor greeted each other with a nod, a sign of mutual respect. The fight began with an almost unbearable intensity. Both were exhausted, but driven by determination and survival instinct. Victor was a formidable opponent, every move calculated and accurate. Kale, with his experience and sharp skills, could keep up with every attack and respond to the height. The minutes turned into a brutal dance, blows exchanged with might and main. Eventually, Kale managed to overpower Victor, using a series of quick moves to disarm him and immobilize him on the ground. As Kale held Victor on the ground, both panting and sweaty, the roar of the crowd became deafening. Cries of death, death. They echoed through the arena, demanding the bloody outcome they had come to witness. Kale, with a heavy heart, looked around, feeling the weight of expectation on his shoulders. In the center of the arena, a dais slowly began to rise, revealing a bright and sharp knife. Victor's fate was clear. Kale felt the inner conflict, the struggle between humanity and the need to survive. Knife in hand, he looked at Victor, his eyes reflecting the pain of the decision he was about to make. Victor, lying on the floor, breathed with difficulty, but kept a serene look. "Kale," Victor said, his voice weak but clear, "do what has to be done. There is no other way out." Kale hesitated, but knew Victor was right. The screams of the crowd increased, the pressure to fulfill the final act growing by the second. Victor smiled, a sad, understanding smile, accepting his fate. "You have to win, Kale. For all of us. For your family. Do it." Kale felt tears burn her eyes as she raised the knife. With a cry of pain and frustration, he drove the blade into Victor's chest. The friend let out one last breath, still smiling, before dying in Kale's arms. The arena erupted in applause and shouts of approval. Kale knelt beside Victor's body, breathing heavily, feeling the weight of what he had just done. He had won, but the victory came at a terrible price. As he stood up, still holding the bloody knife, Kale looked up at the Martian sky. He knew that the struggle for survival would continue, but the promise of freedom and redemption moved him forward. Walking out of the arena, Kale knew that moment would forever be etched in his memory. He promised himself that Victor's death would not be in vain. And with this promise, he prepared himself for the next challenges that the arena and life had in store for him. After weeks of intense and exhausting fights, the day of the last fight has finally arrived. Kale had overcome countless adversaries, each fiercer than the last. He was exhausted, his body scarred and his heart heavy with the deaths he had to cause. However, he was also more determined than ever. That last fight would decide his fate. Upon entering the arena, Kale felt the tension in the air. The crowd was more deafening than ever, aware that they were about to witness the climax of the tournament. His opponent, Garak, was already in the center of the arena, waiting with a serious and determined expression. Garak was an imposing man, taller and heavier than Kale, with an equally remarkable MMA background. Kale and Garak approached each other, exchanging glances of respect and recognition. Both knew they were about to face one of the biggest challenges of their lives. "I think it was inevitable, wasn't it?" said Garak with a bitter smile. "Yes," Kale replied, keeping her voice steady, "but only one of us will get out of here alive." The arena judge gave the signal for the match to begin, and the two men began circling each other, studying each move carefully. The crowd fell silent for a brief moment, anxious for what was to come. Garak attacked first, his blows quick and powerful. Kale deftly dodged, using his agility to dodge and counterattack. The confrontation was brutal, a dance of strength and technique. Each stroke exchanged caused the crowd to explode into shouts of excitement. Garak launched a straight right with the force of a hammer. Kale swerved to the left, feeling the wind from the blow pass close to his face. He responded with a quick jab, followed by a left cross, hitting Garak in the jaw. The giant retreated a step, but soon returned to the offensive. Kale knew that he could not face Garak head-on for long. He needed to use his speed and technique. He quickly approached, launching a sequence of knees to Garak's abdomen, followed by a rising elbow that opened a cut above his opponent's right eye. Garak roared in pain and anger, grabbing Kale by the neck and attempting a clinch. Using the Muay Thai clinch, Kale pulled Garak's head down and threw more knees, this time targeting his ribs and stomach. Realizing the danger, Garak took a quick step forward and applied a double leg takedown, knocking Kale down with an impact that made the arena shake. On the ground, the fight turned. Garak tried to stabilize his position, seeking lateral control. Kale, however, used his Brazilian jiu-jitsu technique to defend. He quickly did a shrimping, escaping Garak's lateral control and trying to regain his guard. Garak, realizing the danger, tried an American, forcing Kale's arm at a painful angle. But Kale, with years of BJJ experience, kept her cool. He made a quick move with his hip, breaking Garrick's grip and escaping submission. Now in the guard, Kale began to work. He pulled Garrick closer, controlling his postures with his legs. He waited for the right moment and then made a quick transition to the closed guard position. From there, he tried a triangle, but Garrick defended well, forcing Kale to change strategy. Kale then used a scissor sweep, to reverse position, coming out on top at half guard. Kale was determined to win. He held Garrick tightly and began to throw powerful punches in the face of the opponent, who was desperately trying to defend himself. The crowd was in a frenzy, shouting at every blow Kale delivered. Garrick, now visibly exhausted and bruised, tried once again to get up. Kale took advantage of the opening and managed to grab Garrick's back and moved on to the rear naked choke, a lethal choke in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. However, with superhuman strength, Garrick managed to escape from the position, reversing the situation. He knocked Kale to the ground with a devastating slam, taking the air out of his lungs. Kale felt the pain spread through his body, but tried to get up. Garrick did not give time. Being bigger and heavier, he immobilized him again and began to deliver brutal blows. Kale, exhausted and wounded, tried to resist, but his movements were slow. Garrick seized the opportunity, pinning Kale to the ground. The dais in the center of the arena rose again, revealing a knife. Garrick, with a look of grim determination, picked up the gun and approached Kale. Kale, breathing hard, knew that his end was near. "Do what has to be done," Kale murmured, his voice almost a whisper. Garrick hesitated for a moment, looking at Kale's bruised face. Then, with a quick and precise movement, he drove the knife into Kale's chest. The crowd erupted in applause and shouts of victory. Kale felt the intense pain, but a strange peace began to take over his body. Before closing his eyes, Kale muttered his last words, addressed to his beloved wife, Lyra. "Forgive me, Lyra. I failed. But now I will finally be able to see our Ava Maya. Never mind. I'll take care of her." With one last breath, Kale was gone, a quiet smile on her lips. He had found the peace he had long sought, leaving behind the brutal world of the arena. Garrick, with the knife still in his hands, looked at Kale's bloodied body and then at the Martian sky. Feeling the weight of victory and the responsibility he now carried, he was free. Thank you very much to those who have supported the channel financially through the link in the comment pinned. This helps me to bring more and more stories to you. And don't forget to like and also subscribe to continue receiving the new stories.